Yeah, and then I'll sit down. Are you doing Quran first? Yeah, yeah, it would be a good idea. Which cousin? This one. Cousin.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Respected guests, brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And peace be upon you. Just before we start, I'd just like to ask Brother Kazim Uka to recite a few verses from the Holy Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى سيذكر من يخشى ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصلح النار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much, Kazim, for that beautiful recitation. I'd like to invite our guests, Dr. Morgan Clarke and Dr. Raza Bhojani, to join me on the table, please. Could you recite Nara Salawat as they join us, please? Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. My name is Mariam, and I will be chairing this event tonight. I would like to start with introductions and thanking our two guests who have come from quite a distance to join us. Dr. Morgan Clarke and Dr. Raza Bhojani from the University of Oxford are here to talk to us about the current research, like Dr. Yakat Deuji mentioned, which involves a study of the lived experience of Sharia. Facilitated by the Council of European Jamaats, COEJ, this has begun with an initial case study of focusing on Shia communities here in the UK, and we hope that this will also involve them spending some more time in South London with us. They will speak to us for 30 minutes on the project so far, future plans, and some emergent findings from the work that they have been doing so far. Followed on by half an hour for Q&A and discussions. Before I hand the mic over to them, I'd like to introduce and say a little bit of both about them. Dr. Morgan Clarke is Associate Professor in Social Anthropology at the University of Oxford. He has long-standing interest in the anthropological study of Sharia and is an author of a few books, including Islam and New Kinship, Reproductive Technology and Sharia in Lebanon, Islam and Law in Lebanon, Sharia Within and Without the State. He has worked to develop the comparative study of Ruli ethics, most recently through a forthcoming interdisciplinary volume, Ethics with the Rules, Ethics and Conscious, Perspectives from Anthropology and History, co-edited with Emily Corrin, under review at MUP, together with a new Anthropology of Rules book that he recently has done in his research fellowship. Together with him, we have Dr. Raza Bhojani, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Anthropology at the University of Oxford. He has also taught at the University of Nottingham, where he remains an honorary research fellow in theology and religious studies. His research focuses on Islamic legal and theological traditions, in particular within Shi'i Islam. He's the author of Moral Rationalism and Sharia, a study of independent rationality in modern Shi'i, Usul al-Fiqh, and co-editor of Visions of Sharia, Contemporary Discussions of Shi'i Legal Theory. I would like to now hand over to Dr. Raza Bhojani to say a few words.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وأهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين. So it's a pleasure to be here in Haydari with you all, and we're grateful for you to take the time out to listen to us, and hopefully we look forward to your thoughts and comments and feedback on the work which we want to share. So as Sister Maryam said, we're here to give you a sense of this project, its aims, its direction, and also start to discuss some of the emergent findings with you. And we look forward to, inshallah, a discussion with you.
Right, okay, now it's my turn. So thank you very much indeed to the community for this very kind invitation and for staying to listen to you all. But thank you to all of the communities, the Jama'at, that have been helping us with this project, and to COEDGE as well for facilitating it. It's very, very gratefully received. Anyway, as regular lecturers, we're probably okay without the microphone. But anyway, so why this project? It's because we think that the way that the Sharia is thought about and approached, obviously in wider public life, but also in academic discussions, is inadequate. Studies of the Sharia in the university are dominated by questions of political authority and law, family law, for example, that runs through the academic scholarship, but then as a result, but independently of that, the way that Sharia is talked about in the media and amongst the public is also dominated by those kinds of questions: criminal law, family law, and so on. So that's a result, I think, of a lack of attention to what Sharia or fiqh, the rules of Islam, what they might mean to Muslims as part of their everyday life and their everyday religious and ethical practice. So how would we understand that better within the university and then hopefully communicate that better outside the university? I think we need an interdisciplinary approach, which is why we've got this team, an interdisciplinary team. Somebody who's an expert in the texts and teachings of Islam, because it will be very difficult to understand what Muslims are doing and think they're doing without some understanding of those texts. And that's something that Ali Raza is an expert in. But then also we need some way of understanding the practice of those rules, what they mean to people in their life. So we need a social science approach that looks at that practice. So that's why we've got this team.
So I'll say something. We're going to flip through. You know, both of us are going to speak as we go. So if you get bored of one of our voices, don't worry. Okay, you'll hear the other one as well. All right. So something about the project itself. So Mughals just talked a little bit about the context. We move on to the project itself. So the project which we're currently engaged in, or this current phase of the project, which we're calling the Living Sharia Project. Okay, so this phase that we're calling the Living Sharia Project is funded through the Oxford University Press John Fell Fund, and it's focusing on a Khoja case study. Okay, that's been running this year since February. And as Morgan has said, the aim is to focus on the practice of Sharia in people's everyday lives, moving that attention away from the courts, away from politics, away from questions of international relations. And this is towards a broader project, which we're planning and hope will commence in 2020 for a further 3 years. And that project will be framed around a broader question about the practice and the purpose of rules in Islam and beyond. So it will look to compare the data that we found, the study that we've engaged with, okay, between Shia and Sunni readings of Islam, across religions, so the importance of rules. You know, we think this is something unique to Islam, this attention to fiqh, this attention to daily practice. But rules in different ways frame Christian thinking, frame Jewish thinking, frame secular thinking. You know, the rules of, I have to go to the gym tomorrow. I have to do an hour and a half. These are a form of rules. So we want to contextualize our study, like we said, across Islam, across religions, and beyond broader philosophies.
So, what has that study involved so far? It's involved textual analysis. So, I've sat down with Ali Raza, and he has helped me to read some of these texts of fiqh, not just the Risala, the individual rules, but we've also looked at some of the theory of those rules. So, for example, Sayyid Sistani's Kharij notes on Usul al-Fiqh and what the theory is behind these rules, so that I can gain a deeper understanding of that. So that's one aspect of the project, to get into the texts. But then the other aspect is field work, participant observation, as anthropologists call it, which means hanging out with people and trying to understand something of what their lives are like, particularly in the context of coming to centres like this. And so far that's involved 5 field trips in Leicester, Birmingham and Stanmore. So we've done more than one in 2 of those. And those have been really fantastic opportunities for me to understand a bit more about what the community's life is like, especially its ritual life. I've really appreciated those. But our research has focused around sitting down and talking to people about what fiqh, about what sharia, the rules of fiqh, mean to them in their daily lives. So we've spoken to more than 60 people on that basis so far. It's been absolutely a wonderful opportunity.
So in terms of the pilot case, as we've said, we've focused initially on the Khoja Shia community. So an obvious question is, you know, when we want to try and, you know, we've got these broad goals of trying to nuance the understanding of Islam more generally. Okay, why start with the Khoja Shia? Yeah, so obviously, as Dr. Dewji kindly introduced me as our own Ali Raza Bhojani, you know, I have a privileged access. And of course, I see this as an extended home. But that's not the only reason. You know, we see the Khoja community has a very clear community structures which we know about. You know, educational structures, shared values and identities, which allow us to assess things in a very structured manner as a good case. You know, it's apolitical positioning, you know, of the Khoja community is very important, because as we said, a lot of the attention to the practice of Sharia is tied up with questions of international relations. You know, so the apolitical positioning of the Khoja community helps us untangle some of those issues. And of course, there is a strong model of Sharia commitment. You know, the community sees itself as an observant community, aspires to be an observant community. Right? And of course, in addition to that, the clear model of taqleed, which the community holds, you know, privileging or foregrounding a single marja, also makes it a very good case for us to study, okay, to use as a balance to broader conceptions.
Right, okay, so how could the findings of those interviews and that experience be used in academic publications and discussions? Because that's something people often want to know. How is this stuff actually going to be used? So because we've already conducted over 60 interviews, we do have some data already. So we had some stuff to work with. And recently we were invited to give a paper at Cambridge University at a conference there about religious authority, comparing Jewish approaches to religious authority, Christian approaches to religious authority, and Muslim approaches to religious authority. Now, although religious authority isn't where we start, because we want to talk to people about their everyday practice, of course, one's right practice is often oriented towards a model of authority, especially the marja. And the way that, in sort of coming to try and write about what taqleed of a marja might actually mean in practice, we found that our findings really challenged a lot of the ways in which that's thought about in the academic literature. And more than that, so I mean, we can come back to that perhaps a little bit at the end about the ways in which they challenged it, but also in order to try and analyze these findings, to think them through, we wanted to use some of the terms of philosophers. What does authority mean? So we looked at some of the ideas that philosophers have about that. And we think that the insights that people have given to us in our discussions really help, but also challenge some of those ideas, because in fact they leave out God, who is quite important to these notions of religious authority, but hasn't really been thought about in these philosophical discussions about authority.
So some of the things that we're drawing on, to give you an example, so we said that in this paper that we presented in Cambridge, the sense of following the sharia, referring to a marja or an expert or an alim or a mufti, okay, the picture in the academic literature and the picture in the wider media doesn't reflect the theory in the books or the lived practice. All right, so we want to give you an example of how. Right, so in terms of the theory, looking at Sayyid Sistani's theory of taqleed himself, what's going on? For Sayyid Sistani, the theory of taqleed is the following of an expert. Just in a nutshell, you guys are familiar with these things, okay? So what is taqleed for Sayyid Sistani? According to his, as Morgan was saying, analysis of his Kharij notes on taqleed, that the taqleed is the following of an expert's opinion on sharia. It's not the placing of responsibility on a mujtahid. Okay, it's a person following the opinion of an expert. And that the scope, interestingly, this may be a misconception some of us have on the ground, but according to Sayyid Sistani's own theory, the scope of this following is not absolute. Right? It excludes what he describes as the necessary elements of religion. Okay, the dururiyat. Okay, where one is certain or in widely accepted issues. All right, so on these things, alhamdulillah, we have our community to teach us. We have the madrasa, we have the mimbar, we have what our parents have taught us. These commonly accepted things. You don't have to refer to the sale on every single little question. Okay? So the scope of the following is not absolute. The role of the mujtahid is to give one an opinion. We're not placing a responsibility upon them. And the necessity of this taqleed, according to the theory, is that it's based on an ordinary, rational convention. What the ulama refer to as bana al-uqala. Okay, a normal convention of relying upon experts. So the way that the ulama position it is this is a rational practice, which is ultimately authorized by God. So that's the theory. Okay?
That's right. So then, how then also did the people that we've been speaking to so far, and hopefully we'll speak to more, but how does their experience and their thoughts bear on that matter? First of all, it was very clear from our conversations that taqleed of an authority on religion is very important. There's a distinction that's drawn in the philosophical literature. Sometimes people think about authority as meaning somebody who's in political power, somebody who's in authority. But
so Miriam's in authority right now. She tells us something,
That's right, she's the chair. But there's also the idea of being an authority on a subject, being an expert. And this was very much the idea that everybody had in their mind, that taqleed of somebody, following somebody's opinion who's an expert on religion, was very important to them. That probably won't be a surprise, but what was more surprising to us, I think, was what that might mean, that consulting an opinion, that taqleed of an opinion, that was understood and performed in many different ways, actually. There was an incredible variety, perhaps as various as the people we spoke to, of what that might actually mean in practice. For some people, Sharia, we ask people what they think about how one might translate the word Sharia. Should it be translated as a set of laws or a set of rules? People had different ideas on that, perhaps reflecting their different emphases on the place of those rules in their lives. But where the authority or seeking out an authoritative opinion was important was at points of deliberation, points of tension, points of doubt where one's not sure. As Ali Raza was saying, actually, in most cases, people felt that they knew what they needed to do, but there are certain times in one's life when one's not sure, and that's the time when seeking an authority's opinion might be important. So that might be in one's professional life. We had many instances of that, but that could also be in one's interactions with wider society. I mean, a very familiar example, which I'm sure is familiar to you as well, was when one's faced with whether or not to shake someone's hand, for example, of the other sex. And so we had many discussions about that, people aware of the rules on that, but also aware of the way that that might be in tension with other principles and teachings of Islam. And so that meant, and we could feel from everyone we spoke to a very deep sense of responsibility to do the right thing, but the sense that that might involve a tension between different kinds of principles and rules, and that of course depends on the context, and people came to different decisions in different times, but never, I think, did we see them saying, oh well, I can just follow an opinion and then that'll be fine. There's no sense in which following an authority means that you just stop thinking. And the reason why I say that is because that's another way in which philosophers have thought of what authority might mean. It means that once somebody is an authority, you can just follow what they say and you'll be fine. You won't have to think anymore for yourself. But that's not something we found. There wasn't that, what the philosophers call the suspension of judgment or responsibility. And so that when one follows an opinion, you're following the opinion because it's a Maharaja's opinion. It wasn't because you weren't aware of the other reasons and you didn't think about the other reasons why you might have to do that thing. It wasn't, quote unquote, a matter of blind obedience. Now I just want to sum up there, because we gave this paper and we had a reaction from a scholar from America, a very prominent American scholar. She said, I loved your paper. I really loved your paper, because here in the United States, she also works in many Shi'i contexts and had worked in Lebanon like me. In the United States, people think that these Shi'i scholars, these Shi'i ayatollahs, they're theocrats, they're there, bossing everyone around, and their followers follow them blindly, with blind obedience. And that is, I think, a very common stereotype of what it might mean to have a religious authority. That they have power over you, but also that you follow their opinion without thinking. And I think our study, although, as I said, the Maharaja is not the center of our study has been able to show that each of those preconceptions is incorrect. And I think that is actually quite important.
So that's how we use some of the study so far in the context of our academic session on religious authority. But like we set up, our study isn't about religious authority. It's about the lived experience of Sharia. So just to touch on some of the broader emergent findings, and then maybe we can move towards a discussion and question and answers. It's become clear to us, and hopefully now we can demonstrate, if you like, empirical evidence. Everyday practice of Muslims cannot be understood simply by focusing on fiqh. Now this might come as no surprise to us sitting around the room. Okay? But when somebody wants to understand about Islam, what do? They refer to Islamic law, this thing, this imaginary thing called sharia. Okay? Now hopefully we've got empirical evidence which shows to people that the everyday practice cannot be understood solely by focusing on fiqh. In terms of even the textual traditions, we have to have attention to akhlaq, to kalam, theology, to falsafa. Because in people's everyday deliberations, everyday thinking, these things are informing their decision-making process, okay, continually. Sometimes it's implicit. You know, we don't recognize how much it is that inspiration of Imam Hussein or so on and so forth is actually informing my day-to-day practice. But for outsiders, they think, how do Muslims live? We have to open a book of fiqh to understand it. All right? So that's one thing that's become very clear to us. And that decision-making, making decisions, and the use of fiqh is always mediated. Okay? And this is something which, as we said, the theory of even Sayyid Sistani recognizes. So as I said early on, Sayyid Sistani said, in those widely accepted issues, in the dhururiyat al-deen and the dhururiyat al-madhhab, the necessarily accepted elements of the faith, and those things which are commonly accepted, people can rely upon trustworthy sources of knowledge, which isn't the marja. This is what we do on a daily basis without thinking about it. Okay? Yeah, so decision-making and the use of fiqh on the ground is always mediated. It's mediated, of course, by the alim, the ulama, the resident alim. You know, his name or her name, unfortunately, is less of the hers than the he's, came up continuously in our discussions with people. The community structures themselves. You know, when Morgan was asking people, how do you know what the rules are? And people thought about it. First they say, yeah, I do taqleed of Sayyid Sistani. Then when they thought about it, how do I actually know what the rules are? I said, well, usually it's because I was taught them at madrasa. Or I hear them on a drip basis every week. You know, and it's only when I have a problem that I will then go to another avenue of exploration. So the community structures. So if we want to understand Muslim practice, you know, the community structures have become very, very important. And of course the societal context and the other values which are brought in. Okay, whether that's, you know, a specific Khoja understanding of the family. Okay, and the specific Khoja values. Okay, or whether this the, you know, particular way Khojas are living here in the UK, and you have this intersection of different values going on. So the role of local scholars, the role of community structures, societal context and values, and of course this individual sense of responsibility. It's quite clear. Now we've got empirical evidence to support that the individual sense of responsibility is always central to people's choices, okay, in Sharia observance.
Okay, so, I mean, I hope that gives you an idea of the sorts of things we've been talking to people about, the sorts of ideas that have been coming through, but also something of how that might turn into something that can help challenge or refine some ideas that people have in the university. And of course, I mean, we're hoping that this will result in academic publications, but we do hope that, you know, that's important because the university is a place that people go to for authoritative knowledge about the world. So it does matter what people in universities think and write. And also the sorts of academic publications that there are out there about Islam and the Sharia are used to teach students who then go out into the wider world. So, I mean, these academic publications are important to us, but are more important more generally, I think. It's very important to us that this study can, I mean, the community, Khoja community has been very, very supportive, and we're very grateful for that. But we really do hope that in some sense it can also be useful for the community to have this kind of information, to discuss it. We're going to have a workshop with members of Khowaj and others to try and think about how this sort of study can be useful to the community itself, to inform their activities, teaching and so on. But the other thing that we hope, I mean, this is the most ambitious and difficult aim of all perhaps, but is that studies like this can go to form resources that can improve public understandings of Sharia, because they're in a pretty bad state. at the moment, as I'm sure you don't need me to tell you. But if one could put together a set of resources that tell people another side of what Sharia might mean to Muslims, the everyday side, the everyday practice, if that's something that can help the media but perhaps also help in schools, that's something we would be very, very, very pleased and proud to help do. So, please feel free to get in touch with us about the project. We've got, maybe the last slide will come, but otherwise we can distribute our email addresses, our contact details. I'm sure there'll be, and if you would like to know more about the study, talk more about the study, even participate in the study, then we would be very, very, very pleased to hear from you. So thank you very much indeed again for your attention.
Yeah, we're really grateful for your time and for listening to us, and hopefully we're here for some time for any questions or feedback for us, inshallah. Yeah? Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you very much. I thought the topic was very inspiring. I really thought it was really interesting, the individual sense of responsibility and being able to address the stereotype about what taqleed actually means to the outside world. I'd like to open the floor to questions and discussions to both the brothers and the sisters. If there's anyone who'd like to ask a question.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Actually, thank you so much. I think you have put a lot of work into your findings and everything. Fantastic talk and everything. And I hope you'll carry on, and there must be a lot of finding. Now, one question arises. Before Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Boko Haram, people didn't even know there was Sharia law. It was never been discussed. It was not as dangerous. And all those 3-4 groups who are well into this media and everything, killing, in fact, a lot of Muslims themselves. And either the world doesn't understand that these cannot be Muslims. You have seen very recently the thing what happened in Syria. The children were literally slaughtered, burnt alive. Sisters were raped. They were enslaved. So I think whether the world really is trying to play a dirty game on Muslim, because Sharia law was never been discussed before all this terrorism started. Nobody questioned what was a Sharia law. And another thing what I'm surprised, how many people in this country really understand what the law is. You go out in the open and ask people, how do you understand the law of this country? I'm telling you, 99% probably people are not aware what are their rights, what are the laws. So it is very difficult to say that a group of religion people should know all the laws. I mean, it is very, very difficult. But alhamdulillah, I think what we are doing is a fantastic job. Yeah. I think it has to be brought out. This Sharia law, whatever people are hearing, is nothing to do with Islam. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, thank you very much indeed for those questions. Shall I answer now? Yes. I think they're very good questions. I think people probably did talk a bit about Sharia law before Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but I take your point that those kind of activities have given a certain idea about Sharia law and put it into the public domain. But I think it's interesting that you say Sharia law. And I think that's very often the way that the word sharia enters into public discourse, sharia law. And I think that's one of the things we've been quite interested to talk to people about. Do you think that law, or even the word sharia, is the best way of talking about this everyday practice? Sometimes we ask people, should we be talking about fiqh instead? Maybe people shouldn't write about sharia in the newspaper. They should say, when I say sharia, I mean, you know, the sort of sharia law punishments that so-and-so groups are doing. I don't mean what Muslims in their everyday life are doing, that's fiqh. Or should we talk instead of sharia law about sharia rules? I mean, would it be possible to change the way that sharia is talked about by getting rid of that association with law, which suggests criminal law and those kind of activities? So that's one sort of idea that we've been talking to people about, and they've had very interesting thoughts about it. So that would be my response on that. I think it's a brilliant observation. I absolutely agree that 100% of the people, maybe, or 99.9 whatever percent of the people in the UK couldn't tell you more than about 0.5% of what the law was, or maybe less. I mean, we live under this legal system, but we have no idea what all those laws are. I think that's absolutely true, and is very important for people when they talk about, you know, liberal democracy and living under the rule of law and so on. Actually, we don't know what most of those laws are. Doesn't mean that they're not important, but we don't know what they are. I think what you were then suggesting was, why would one assume that Muslims knew very much about their laws either? I think from our conversations, we got the impression that they did know, the people that we've spoken to did know quite a lot of the rules, actually. But we don't go into it with the assumption that they should do, or even that they do. And it's been very interesting to ask them, you know, do they know lots of rules? But you do have at least some very handy sources that you can go to find out what the laws are. We don't, as citizens in the UK, have a nice little book that would tell you what well, perhaps we do, I just have never read it, but maybe there is a good book that tells you what the law of the UK is, or maybe there should be an app that I could turn to and find out what, you know, the tax law is. Maybe there is, I've never done it. But I think that that's a very interesting point of comparison, but we've got an open mind to that. That's something we would ask in our interviews. But thank you, very good questions. Do you want to respond to that?
Add something as well? Yeah. So thank you. Some excellent questions and observations. Maybe just add something. You know, again, coming from the university's perspective, you know, when did discussion of Sharia explode? And I think we should be aware of these things. You know, but if you look at the studies of Islam, British Muslims, European Muslims, never mind even the discourse of Sharia. When did the issues of Islam in Europe explode in the academic scene was 1979. Okay, and a fatwa. All right, now some of the elders around us are nodding. Okay, but yeah, it was a fatwa of Ayatollah Khomeini. Okay, on the satanic verses issues. So there was attention to these things before, but for sure, of course, the current situation you're well aware of and described it really well. Even back then, we see the attention wasn't on Sharia as daily practice. Still then, okay, rights, wrongs, debates about what went on then are aside, and there were important debates, okay? But on a daily basis, what does Sharia mean to the people of England, Muslims living in England, and even what does Sharia on a daily basis mean to the people in Iran or in Syria? You know, it's, as you were pointing out, this is about, you know, the daily devotional practices and ethical deliberation. And that's where we want to move the discussion. You know, that's where we want to move the discussion, inshallah.
Yeah, shall we give it to non-Khoja man? That's my son-in-law, non-Khoja, half Khoja.
Thank you. Also a tax lawyer, so I can confirm that there is no app. Thankfully, I'd be out of a job. The question about the, maybe it's quite a difficult question to answer, but speaking about Sharia as a sort of day-to-day practice, something that shapes the lives of people. And I think that very much sort of historically the idea of multiculturalism, I think in the UK in particular, sort of embraced that in a sense that you can, you know, we sort of promoted this idea that you can have different communities living in their day-to-day lives and according to their own practices, and the nation or you know the the nation of the UK could embrace all of that and those different practices. It seems that today that really has come under tension, and Putin just the other day, you know, I think it was yesterday, he made a statement about, you know, multiculturalism, you know, having run its course in the West as being one of the ideas as well. What's your take on sort of, where do you see the future lying? In a sense, you know, clearly there's been a lot of discourse in the past, you know, attacking the law of Sharia. In a sense, that sort of doesn't really affect the, you know, that can be frustrating for a Muslim, because obviously we see it as sort of talking down against us a lot. But actually, in terms of our day-to-day lives, none of us, you know, it doesn't really impact on us. Whereas I think now we're seeing more and more media discourse and more discussion around actually, you know, is it possible to have people living in a different way without tearing apart the fabric of society or destroying, you know, the nation and causing a nation to lose its identity. So what's your thought on the sort of future and the sort of trends in that sort of school of thought, or those ways of thinking? Thank you.
Let's have a go, yeah. All right, well, that's a very thoughtful and thought-provoking question as well. So there's no doubt that we're living at a difficult time in that regard, and in the way that political discourse has changed, and so that, attacking that idea of living together, people with different sorts of ideas and different ways of life living together. Some people are getting political capital out of attacking that idea, which, yes, I mean, I feel that as a danger. One of the reasons why I was interested in rules in particular, and so sort of interested in fiqh and sharia as rules, is that it's become, or perhaps it always has been, but it's a way that we show respect to each other in a multicultural society. And the idea that you would have different dietary possibilities in college, in Oxford, in the university, you know, you have a set of dietary preferences that you can register, and that's a way in which you show respect for those kind of differences. It seems like a very trivial level, but I mean, it just didn't exist before. I think that's probably baked in now. I think it'd be hard to imagine people going back from that. And then we have, you know, and there's all sorts of other projects, vegan projects and so on, so that it's not just a matter of showing religious respect, but it's a way of showing respect for people's different ethical commitments. I can't imagine that being, well, I hope not, but, you know, to a world where everyone has to eat the same thing, otherwise tough luck. And it also runs counter, I mean, in a more cynical mode, it runs counter to the logic of capitalism, so that, you know, by providing all of those options, you know, it's a great business opportunity. I'm sure that's going nowhere. I'm sure that's going to be around. But, and just living together will require doing so. But whether the philosophy of multiculturalism will survive, I don't know. That is a much more difficult question. I mean, I can't say. I can't see into the future. But I get the sense of your question that there's a sort of deeper question about how we think about how we can live together, and whether thinking of the country as made up of different cultures was that the best way of doing it. Maybe thinking about people as having different sorts of commitments that we can accommodate within a set of rules, maybe that's actually in some ways quite a good way of doing it. What do you think?
Yeah. So I think the problem is here we're taking one question and both of us are speaking, so we might not have a chance for many questions, but I'll give some thoughts anyway, if that's okay. Yeah. So yeah, I agree, really good question. And I think some of the tensions in terms of multiculturalism has been this, you know, where's integration and where's assimilation? Yeah, so at least speaking from the Muslim perspectives, they think, okay, you know, what does it mean, the multicultural? The British society can, you know, the vision was British society can have space for all different cultures. Okay, but what is that meant to mean? Again, speaking from an insider's perspective, okay, that yeah, I should be able to live in Britain and never interact with anybody outside my culture. Right? Because sometimes that's been the concern of people viewing Muslim communities. You can go to Leicester, you know, and every street is Gujarati speaking. Someone can spend their whole week and never speak a word of English. Right? Is that a vision of multiculturalism which is positive or not? I mean, we have to ask these critical questions internally as well. So there's this tension between integration and assimilation. Right? But there's no doubt that the perceptions about Islam, okay, are shaping these debates in popular discourse. And it's becoming polarizing. Yeah, no doubt. All right? How do we get over that? Or how can we contribute to changing that? Of course, active engagement is critical, and to try and get past that hype. You know, I don't know, Haydari's been very, very advanced in these types of things, but it also means we're willing to open ourselves up. You know, like I said, not to live in our ghettos, to seek to actively contribute to the broader societies, you know, as part of those broader societies, and not just people here to use the society and pass along. So I think these things are two-way, really difficult to see how they will go in the future. But beyond the philosophical questions, I think there's active responsibility, you know. And of course, the interpretation of sharia, you know, I believe is also dynamic, and always has been dynamic. Yeah? And that is informed by the lived experiences, okay? And maybe this is something we should want to give attention to in the project.
Maria?
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I wanted to find out from you, how does Sharia as a lived experience differ from how the Sharia is defined by the Quran? That's one question. Second one is, are the hudud punishments part of the Sharia? Because obviously, if you read the right-wing extremist propaganda, one of the clear reasons they do not want Islam as part of European society is because of the many hudud punishments, such as throwing gays from a cliff or from the buildings, stoning to death, adulterers, crucifixion that is practiced by Saudi Arabia. I think I read an article today, one of the reasons to invade Iran was because it practices all these nasty hudud punishments. Are these part and parcel of the Sharia, or are they added to the Sharia? Can they be interpreted away, or what? What is the future? Because it's causing a lot of tension. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that Morgan's asking me to respond to this, so I'll have a go. Okay. Yeah, no, I think it would be good if you comment as well. So, how does the lived experience of Sharia compare to the Quranic vision of Sharia? Okay, so again, now, putting my hat on, you know, if you like, as somebody who's been interested in studying usul al-fiqh and legal theory for the last 15 years now, okay? Yeah, we have to have a distinction between Sharia and the Quran. There's a huge distinction between Sharia, okay, defined by ulama as the normative system of regulation in the knowledge of God. Okay, so this is ahkam al-tashri' al-islami. Okay, so God's system for regulating human life, right? Yeah, and the idea is that it's a knowing God, it's a wise God, who would have a response to any given situation. Okay, and so how one ought to respond to any given situation. This is the notion that fuqaha have of the Sharia. It's something in the knowledge of God, right? The Quran is a source of Sharia. Okay, according to our classical theorists, right? The Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, yeah, consensus, and for Shias, independent rationality, right? 4 sources. So there's a distinction, before turning this into a class on legal theory, right? There's a distinction between Sharia and its sources. So you can say, can it be interpreted away? Coming to more directly to your question. Look, interpretation is a fact. Okay, interpretation is a fact, always has been a fact. Okay, yeah, so the interpretation of these things are pivotal. There is no Sharia of the Quran in my view. In my view, there is no Sharia of the Quran. Because every time we read the Quran, we're doing it through a lens. I might attempt to do it through the lens of Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'in. I might try to do it through, you know, a lens of Western liberal philosophy. Okay, I might try to do it in the lens of no other source. Even that's a lens. Yeah, so unfortunately we can't get past interpretation. We can't. All right? And this is the same for any constitution, any law. I don't believe the Quran is a legal document. But it's the same for America. They fight over the constitutions. They closed the, effectively they closed their equivalent of the parliament because of a fight over constitution. You know, government shutdown over legal debates. So interpretation is a fact. It's a reality, you know, and I think we're very, very privileged, okay, within the diversity of Islam. That a solid approach to Islam embraces this. And this is part of the reason why, you know, Islam can live in different contexts, because interpretation is a fact. Yeah? And even according to, you know, yeah, I think I'll leave it there before change the discussion entirely.
So I mean, I can't comment from the tradition, from the theological side, and Ali Reza has done so. That's good. So that I don't have to do that, but I can comment from the conversations that we've had, I guess. So one thing that might be good to say is that, as we were touching on the fiqh and the rules of fiqh, for no one was their whole ethical life, or everything that they brought into their deliberation, everything that they were thinking about. They were thinking about other teachings and akhlaq and other principles of Islam, and of course referring to the Quran was part of that as well. In our conversations, people would talk about some verses, or you know, that would be part of their general ethical reference point, of course, I think. So I'm not sure that it differs from it, but it certainly involves it. And then, with regard to those strong punishments, those sort of those that loom large in these critiques of Sharia, I suppose, those were things that were mentioned too. Not because people were sort of concerned about how one might, you know, perform them or something like that, but because they were concerned in the ways I think you've suggested as to how to think about them, what one does with them. If one's challenged by them, by a non-Muslim or something like this. And I think most people, well, so that came up in the conversations, but not to generalize, but Ali Reza can say if this is fair, but I think for most people they just say, actually I just bracket them off. I mean, that just isn't part of what I understand my tradition to be. I mean, I just don't. I don't know if you think that's fair, Ali Reza.
I think that's fair. So we've been talking about this, a sense of a mission. Okay, so we're having people saying, I'm committed to the Sharia, I'm committed to fiqh, but this stuff just isn't relevant to me. Right? Now, we do need to change the debate slightly, because that's the same for people of other traditions. Okay, well, do I hold my Christian neighbor to account on the basis of a particular interpretation of the Bible? Right? So the debates are often focused on text rather than lived experience. Actually, what are the concerns of non-Muslims in the UK? They're worried about the Muslim living next door. They're not worried about the texts. So one aim of this project is actually shift the debate from the theological to the lived experience. Actually, that's one really important aim of this project. It's my hope that a focus on the lived experience can also inform the theological. Yeah? So these are real issues, but we want to flag up with empirical, with empirical proof. There's this detailed study which shows that, I don't know, 99%, in fact, not a single one of these people think hudud has anything to do with their daily practice of Sharia. Yeah? Okay, we didn't find a single one. All right, and of course we could give theoretical justifications, not theoretical justifications, but at the end of the day, I think this is important for people. And then, can this be a way of us thinking within our community structures? You know, that's the other thing we try to highlight. That actually, what's most important is these, for people's everyday practice, the community structures, the local scholars, the teachers in the madrasa, the family. Collectively, can we think of a way how to communicate these things? You know? So these are the sorts of things that we're trying to do. Hopefully that, to some extent, you know, helps. We could, I think, as a separate discussion, I was going to pick up those verses of hudud and offer, because even from a Quranic point of view, okay, I could say that a Quranic Sharia doesn't necessarily necessitate chopping of hands. Yeah, I could offer an interpretation of the Quran holistically, okay, to argue that no, this isn't suggesting we need to chop hands today. But that's going to shift the point of our discussion today.
No, I understand. But I think at some point, because the right is going so strong, you will need to look at these issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Anyway. Can I? Says Sorry, if my boss says okay.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your presentation, very interesting research. Just had one question which kind of follows on from something that has been raised. But my first question, if you don't mind, is who's funding the study? And then just your perspectives on how the Sharia might evolve based on everyday lived experience and practice. So I don't know if you're familiar with kind of the distinction between evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. And if you are, that's really what I'm speaking to.
Yeah, sure. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you asked that first one, because we often develop it at slightly greater length, but we didn't today because we wanted to build up some other themes. But who is funding the study? So for the pilot study, it is funded by the Oxford University's John Fell Fund. As far as I'm aware, the John Fell Fund is a pot of money that comes from the profits from Oxford University Press. Oxford University Press makes loads of money, especially because it sells all of those old classic works of British fiction in English, which they don't have to pay any royalties for, so they make absolutely loads of profit off that. It's a department of the university, and then they have this pot of money that faculty in the university can use to start building bigger projects. So that's what it's drawing on. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm assuming it's halal. But I don't know, that's a fiqhi question, so I'm not qualified to answer that. But as far as I'm aware, that's okay. But I understand the concern, so that whether with a source of funding that then creates some kind of expectations and puts you in certain directions. So in this case, it doesn't really. It's a very open pot of funding, so we can sort of do what we want with it. But when it comes to applying to make this into a bigger project, and we need bigger money, then we'll have to apply to other sources of funding. The first port of call should probably be the UK's Research Council funding, which ultimately comes from the taxpayer as mediated through a government-appointed council. And that comes with certain sorts of expectations that your research should have an impact in the world. It doesn't tell you what kind of impact it should have, and I think the sorts of impacts we're talking about are ones that they would be very excited about. But I mean, we're thinking about that very carefully, and that's why we're trying to work with the community in that regard. But we're also trying to be pretty transparent about what we're doing, and so that was something that we would continue. But you're quite right to ask and quite right to push on it. I hope the answer was satisfactory, but can give a more detailed answer if you like. But we're definitely attentive to that. So do you want to answer number 2?
I'll try. Give a sense. Okay, yeah, brilliant. Okay, brilliant. So in terms of how might this inform the interpretation of, how might lived experience inform the interpretation of Sharia? Yeah. So there's actually a long-standing debate in what they call Islamic legal studies. Islamic legal studies is your academic treatment of subjects like fiqh and usul al-fiqh in Western academia. And I'm saying Western academia, but now there's an increasing overlap between Western academia and even seminaries, whether they're Muslim seminaries or, Sunni seminaries or Shia seminaries. There's an increasing engagement, and has been from a number of years, of traditionally trained Muslims involved in academia. But there's a long-standing debate about the relationship between theory of Sharia and its practice. Okay? Yeah, and, is the theory of Sharia prescribing what goes on outside? Yeah, so evidence-based practice, if I understand. You have evidence of the theory, and we prescribe. Is the job, of these legal theory and fiqh to prescribe what's going on outside? Or is the legal theory justifying what's going on outside? If that makes sense, yeah? And maybe modifying. So we're seeing there's this practice going on outside. Can we now understand that as Shari'i? Is it legitimate? Is it not legitimate? How does it need balancing? So we've seen reality outside, and then we go to the sources. Yeah? It's my view that this is what the ulama have always been doing. Okay? Yeah, the interpretation of Sharia has always been in response to lived experience. It couldn't have ever been any other way. Even if you go to the revelation of the Quran itself. Right? Yeah, the Quran was revealed in response over 23 years to different circumstances. It's completely engaged with the lived experience. Does that make sense? Yeah? And even the scholarly interpretation of fiqh and legal theory has been in response to lived experience. Right? So I think it's always been informed. Has it been explicitly informed? I'm not so sure. Right? So coming from a theologian's point of view, or somebody who's interested in legal theory, this is one of my broader interests in working from this kind of bottom-up approach, is to make that process more explicit.
Well, I suppose the only thing I would want to add in a way is that, I mean, it's going to, in terms of the writing around Sharia and the fiqh, rather than say the Sharia itself, but how that writing and that fiqh certainly does evolve. It will definitely evolve. I mean, there's no way it won't evolve. So it's definitely going to evolve, but in no doubt in different directions. And so there will be more quote-unquote liberal interpretations, more conservative. It seems there's there's appetite for all of those out there. So it will go in lots of different directions. But then also there's the question of how its interpretation on the part of the ordinary Muslim rather than the scholar, how Muslims themselves, what their relationship to Sharia is, that will also evolve. And there's certainly been a lot of work within sociology and so on, thinking about the way people can access texts with the fact that, everybody can read now, whereas if you won't have to go back so many hundred years where almost nobody could. And with new media, all of these things mean that the way that Muslims relate to the rules of fiqh has changed enormously. So the tradition might change, the rules might change, but also the way that people relate to them does as well. So there's lots to think about there.
Thank you very much. That was very informative, and that was a very lively discussion. I think that was really informing, and there were a lot of insights that I had myself. Dr. Ali Raza and Dr. Morgan Clarke will still be around for a little while longer if anybody wants to ask a one-on-one question. I'd like to thank the audience for staying and for quite some time. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Yakat Dewji.
For them to eat. Yeah, oh, sure.